My name is Evelyn Harper, and the night before Christmas, while I stood at the top of my own staircase, pretending not to hear a thing, I listened to my children decide what would happen to my house after I was gone. They spoke calmly, almost cheerfully, as if I were already dead. And the cruelest part was this: they believed I couldn't hear a single word. That moment was the climax, though they didn't know it. At the time, they thought it was just another Christmas Eve, another year of lowering their voices around me, another year of assuming silence meant ignorance. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, after 15 years of living in complete silence, I had heard my doctor say the words, "The surgery was successful." But that night, standing in the dim hallway, with the smell of pine and cinnamon drifting up from the living room, I didn't move. I didn't cough. I didn't make a sound. I held onto the banister and listened, because sometimes the truth only comes when people think you're no longer listening. The accident happened when I was 53, a winter pileup on I-70 outside of Columbus, Ohio. Black ice, flashing lights, the crunch of metal I never heard coming. I survived with no broken bones, but the damage inside my head took my hearing completely. One moment I was a working woman with a full calendar and a noisy life, and the next I was wrapped in a quiet so deep it felt like being buried alive. At first, my family rallied. My husband Frank learned sign language alongside me. My kids Mark and Linda wrote notes exaggerated. Their mouths hugged me often. Back then, silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like something we were facing together. Then, Frank died 5 years later. A heart attack, sudden and unfair. After that, the silence changed. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was the absence of patience. Little by little, decisions were made without me. Conversations happened over my shoulder. Jokes were exchanged that ended when I walked into the room. I became easy to manage, easy to overlook, easy to talk about instead of talking to. I still owned my home. Frank and I had paid it off years earlier. A modest 2-story place in a quiet suburb, filled with memories and old furniture, and a creaky third step I never fixed, because Frank used to joke about it. To me, that house wasn't an asset. It was proof of a life lived. To my children, over time, it became something else. I didn't notice the shift all at once. You never do. It's always in small moments. Linda suggesting I sell and move somewhere simpler. Mark asking more questions about paperwork. The way both of them started saying when instead of if. When my audiologist first mentioned a new surgical option, I almost laughed. 15 years was a long time to hope, but hope, it turns out, can survive in very small places. The surgery itself was quiet irony. I went in deaf and came out still deaf, at least at first. Then, 3 days later, sitting alone in my kitchen, I heard the hum of the refrigerator. I dropped my coffee mug. It shattered, and I heard that too. I cried harder than I had at Frank's funeral. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not because I was planning something. Not yet. I just needed time to relearn sound. The world was loud and sharp and overwhelming. Footsteps, traffic, my own breathing. I wanted one perfect moment to share it. Christmas seemed right. So, I practiced pretending. I watched lips. I nodded. I asked for notes. No one questioned it. Why would they? They were used to me being silent. And that's how I found myself on the staircase that night, holding my breath as my own living room filled with voices that weren't meant for me. "She won't hear us," Linda said. I recognized her voice immediately. "You never forget the sound of your child." "I know," Mark replied. "I just don't want this to drag on for years." There was a pause, the clink of a glass. Someone laughed softly. "The house is the main thing," Linda said. "Once Mom's gone, we should sell quickly. No reason to keep it." "She's comfortable now," Mark added. "But honestly, it's only a matter of time." I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly, I was afraid they'd hear it upstairs. They talked about me like a problem to be solved. Not with anger, worse with practicality, with relief. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. My silence hadn't protected me. It had made me invisible. But this time the silence was mine by choice. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry out. I went back to my room and closed the door softly. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the house, the furnace, clicking on the distant laughter, the sound of my own life continuing without me in the room. And for the first time in 15 years, I made a decision based on what I heard, not what I assumed. They thought Christmas would be a surprise for me. They were wrong. Silence changes the way you see people. When you can't hear, you start watching instead. You notice the pause before someone answers, the glance they give another person before responding to you, the way a sentence ends abruptly when you enter a room. During those years, silence didn't just surround me, it sharpened me. After Frank died, my house grew quieter in ways that had nothing to do with hearing. I still lived in the same place, slept in the same bed, watered the same plants. But the tone of my family shifted. They visited less often. When they did, they stayed shorter. I became a stop on the way to somewhere else. At first, I told myself it was normal. My kids were busy. They had jobs, families' obligations. I didn't want to be the mother who clung or complained. So I adapted. I smiled more. I nodded. I let things slide. Living without sound taught me how easily people confuse patience with consent. When my children came over, they talked around me. Not always unkindly, just efficiently. They would sit at the table and discuss plans, while I poured coffee, occasionally, turning to me to summarize in a few exaggerated words, as if that was enough. I learned to read lips well enough to catch fragments, doctor insurance later, but not the full meaning. And when I asked questions, the answers were always reassuring and vague. "You don't need to worry about that," Linda would say, her smile tight but warm. "We've got it handled," Mark would add, already checking his phone. Handled. That word came up a lot. Holidays changed first. We stopped hosting at my house to make it easier. Thanksgiving moved to Linda's place. Christmas became shorter, rushed. Decorations stayed in boxes longer each year. Traditions faded quietly, without argument. I watched it happen and told myself I didn't mind. The truth was, I did mind. But I had learned that pushing only made people pull away. Silence, I believed, was safer. I still handled my own bills. I still balanced my checkbook, still knew exactly where everything was. Frank and I had always been careful. But my kids began asking more questions. Casual questions, framed as concern. "Do you remember where the deed is? Have you thought about simplifying things? Wouldn't it be easier if we helped manage some of this?" I answered politely. I said I was fine, and I meant it. But what I noticed, what silence made impossible to ignore, was how often they spoke to each other when I was right there, how decisions seemed to form before I was included, how I was slowly being repositioned from participant to subject. There were moments that stuck with me. Once I walked into the living room and saw Mark gesturing sharply while Linda nodded. When they noticed me, they both smiled too quickly. Linda handed me a notepad and wrote, "Just talking about work." I watched her lips carefully. She didn't say work. Another time, Linda's husband joked, thinking I couldn't hear, about how easy it must be to plan things when someone can't object. Everyone laughed. I smiled too, because I thought that was what I was supposed to do. Silence trains you to survive by blending in. I became agreeable, low maintenance, the kind of older woman people praised for not being difficult. They didn't realize how much effort that took, or what it cost. When my audiologist suggested the surgery, I didn't tell my kids right away. I wanted to be sure. Hope can make you reckless, and I had learned to be careful. After the surgery worked, after sound began creeping back into my world, I still didn't tell them. Not because I didn't trust them, because I needed to see something clearly first. Sound returned unevenly. Some things were too loud, others faint. Voices came back slowly, layered with years of memory. I started noticing how often my name came up when I wasn't supposed to hear. How often conversations stopped when I entered a room, not because of kindness, but because of convenience. Christmas was approaching, and the house filled. Again, my kids assumed nothing had changed. They spoke freely, too freely. I stayed quiet, not because I had to, because I wanted to know. I wanted to know who I had become to them in those silent years. What I learned hurt more than the accident ever did. Not because they hated me, but because they had already moved on emotionally. They talked about me as if I were a phase nearing its end, an obligation nearing completion. Silence had given me clarity, but it had also taken my voice. And now that I had it back, I understood something important. Staying quiet had not protected me. It had trained everyone else to decide for me. I didn't feel angry yet. Anger comes later, after clarity. What I felt was resolve. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to accuse. I wasn't going to dramatize anything. I had spent 15 years listening without being heard. Now it was time to decide what to do with what I'd seen. The idea of surgery didn't arrive like a miracle. It came quietly, folded into a routine appointment mentioned almost as an aside. My audiologist, young enough to be my granddaughter, told me there had been advances. She didn't promise anything. She never did. She simply said, "Some patients your age are seeing partial restoration, enough to function." Function. That word landed heavier than hope. I went home and sat at my kitchen table, the same one Frank and I had bought secondhand when the kids were small. I ran my fingers along the scratches and thought about sound, what it had meant to me once, what it might mean again. For years, I had learned to live without it. I had told myself I didn't miss it. That was only half true. You can survive without sound. You just don't realize how much of yourself you leave behind. I didn't tell my children about the consultation, not because I was hiding something, but because I wasn't ready to manage their expectations or their doubts. I needed this decision to be mine alone. The pre-surgery tests took weeks. Scans, evaluations forms I read carefully before signing. No one rushed me. For the first time in years, I felt like a full participant in my own life again. When the date was set, I told Linda and Mark I'd be having a minor procedure. I wrote it down. Linda hugged me tightly, a little too tightly. Mark nodded and said, "Let us know if you need anything." Neither asked what kind of procedure it was. The surgery itself was strangely peaceful. Lying on the table lights above me, I felt calm. If it didn't work, I would still be who I was. If it did, I didn't let myself finish that thought. When I woke up, there was no sudden rush of sound. No movie moment, just pressure dizziness, and the doctor's lips forming careful words I couldn't yet hear. They told me to be patient. Sound would come gradually, if at all. The first sound arrived 3 days later, in the quietest way possible. I was alone, rinsing a mug at the sink, when I heard a low hum. I froze. The refrigerator. I turned the tap off and on. I heard water hit porcelain. I laughed out loud and startled myself with the sound of my own voice. That night I lay awake, listening to the house. The tick of the clock, the floor settling, the wind brushing the siding. I cried, not from joy alone, but from grief for all the years I had lived without knowing how much I missed this. I practiced, every day, listening, adjusting, learning which sounds were too sharp, which faded too fast. Voices came last. They were the hardest. They carried memory with them. I didn't tell anyone yet. Not my children, not my neighbors, not even my closest friend from church. I told myself I was waiting for Christmas. I wanted a happy reveal. I imagined standing in the living room, saying their names out loud, watching their faces light up. I imagined laughter, tears, apologies for all the notes and exaggerated gestures. But as the days passed, something else happened. With sound came information. I began hearing fragments I hadn't been meant to hear. A phone call Linda took in the kitchen. Mark speaking to his wife in the hallway. Not shouted, not cruel, just unguarded. I started to understand how much had been said around me when everyone thought I couldn't hear. How often my life had been discussed as a logistical problem. How comfortable they had grown making plans that included me, but did not involve me. I stayed silent. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still nodded. I still accepted written notes. I still pretended. Inside, I was recalibrating. Christmas approached, and with it activity. Boxes in the hallway. Groceries stacked high. My house filled with sound again, and I absorbed it like someone who had been underwater too long. I told myself I was still planning a surprise, that I would reveal everything on Christmas morning, that the things I overheard were misunderstandings taken out of context. Then came Christmas Eve. I had gone upstairs early, claiming a headache. From the landing, I could hear everything, clearer than I was ready for. They talked about timing, about after, about not wanting things to be complicated, about how she doesn't notice anyway. I stood there, one hand on the banister, listening as my regained hearing gave me something else entirely the truth. And in that moment, I understood why the surgery had really changed everything. It wasn't just that I could hear again. It was that I could finally choose when to speak. Christmas Eve always had a smell to it. Pine needles, baked ham, something sweet in the oven. That night, it carried something else to certainty. I didn't go upstairs because of a headache. I went because I needed distance. I needed a place where I could listen without being seen. From the landing, I could see the glow of the tree lights below. I could hear glasses clink. I could hear laughter that didn't include me. I stayed still, my hand wrapped around the banister, reminding myself to breathe quietly. They thought I was deaf. They spoke like people do when they believe the walls themselves won't repeat their words. Mark was the first to say my name. He said it softly, as if that made what followed kinder. "She's comfortable now," he said. "That's what matters." Linda answered him, her voice practical, tired. "Comfortable doesn't mean forever." There was a pause. Someone cleared their throat. I recognized the sound of a wine bottle being set down. I had set bottles down that way for years. "We need a plan," Linda continued. "I don't want this dragging on. We all know how these things go." My heart thudded. Not loudly, just enough for me to feel it in my ears. After Mark said, "After she's gone," the word landed hard. Gone. Not sick, not aging. Gone. As if I were already halfway out the door. They talked about my house next. Not with excitement, with relief. The mortgage-free place Frank and I had worked for, the place with the creaky third step and the lemon-scented cleaner under the sink. They talked about timing the market, about repairs they'd already discussed, about not keeping it for sentimental reasons. "She won't know," Linda said, and laughed lightly. "She doesn't hear a thing." Someone else, my son-in-law, I think, made a joke about how easy it was to plan when the person involved couldn't object. It wasn't mean-spirited. That was the worst part. It was casual, comfortable, like this was a conversation they'd had before. I pressed my shoulder into the wall. I felt cold all over, even though the house was warm. I wanted to rush down the stairs. I wanted to announce myself. I wanted to say, "I can hear you." I wanted to ask how long they'd been thinking this way. I did none of that. They talked about logistics, about assisted living costs, about how long it might be before decisions needed to be made. No one said they wished I would live longer. No one said they hoped I was happy. They spoke as if my life were a timeline nearing its conclusion, not a person sitting above them, listening to every word. What hurt most wasn't that they were thinking about the future. It was that they were doing it without me, and had been for some time. My silence had trained them well. I went back to my room without a sound and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the house continue without me. I heard footsteps, laughter, the television. I heard the life I had built moving forward as if I were already a memory. I didn't cry. Tears felt too loud for what I needed. Instead, I felt something settle inside me, heavy and clear. This wasn't about greed. It wasn't even about cruelty. It was about convenience. And convenience, I had learned, could be far more dangerous. That night, I lay awake, listening to the house breathe. I thought about the years I'd spent being agreeable, about how often I'd chosen not to push, because pushing seemed rude. I thought about how often silence had been praised as grace. By morning, I knew I wasn't going to confront them, not yet. If I did it in anger, they would defend. If I did it in tears, they would comfort and forget. I needed something else. I needed to choose silence again, but this time it would be mine. I started small. I reviewed my paperwork quietly. The deed, the will Frank and I had signed years ago, the beneficiary forms I'd never bothered to update because I trusted my children. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't mention what I'd heard. I listened more. I watched how easily they spoke when they thought I couldn't hear. Christmas morning came and went, with smiles and gifts and notes written in big letters. I played my part. I hugged. I thanked. I nodded. I even laughed at the right moments. Inside, I was already moving forward. What I heard that night didn't turn me bitter. It turned me precise. It taught me the difference between being loved and being managed. It taught me that silence forced on you can erase you, but silence chosen can protect you. They believed they had time. They believed I was unaware. They believed sound was the only way to listen. They were wrong, and I was done being quiet for their convenience. Silence feels different when it belongs to you. Before it had wrapped around me like a heavy coat I never asked to wear. Now it fit like something tailored, intentional, purposeful. I stopped thinking of myself as someone waiting to be acted upon and started thinking like someone preparing. The morning after Christmas, the house was quiet again. Wrapping paper lay folded in a bag, dishes dried on the rack. Linda and Mark left early hugs, quick promises written on a notepad to check in soon. I smiled, waved, and closed the door behind them. When the lock clicked, I stood still for a long moment, listening to the sound of my own breathing in an empty house. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my papers spread out in front of me. Deed, will, insurance, bank statements. Frank had always insisted we keep things orderly, so no one has to guess, he used to say. I was grateful for that now. Everything I needed was there, waiting for me to look at it with clear eyes. I didn't rush. Rushing had never served me well. Instead, I made a list, short, practical, handwritten. Call the attorney. Update beneficiaries. Review the will. Consider a trust. Each item felt grounding, like placing stones across a stream. I called the attorney Frank, and I had used years earlier. His voice was older but steady. I told him I needed to review my documents and discuss options. I didn't explain why. He didn't ask. We set an appointment for the following week. In the meantime, I practiced my silence. I answered messages politely and briefly. I listened when Linda called, asking how I was feeling. Fine, I said, and meant it. Mark asked if I needed help with errands. I've got it, I said, and I did. What surprised me was how calm I felt. There was no rage fueling me, no desire to punish. I wasn't planning revenge in the dramatic sense. I was planning protection, boundaries, a future where my voice, spoken or not, couldn't be dismissed. At the attorney's office, I laid everything out, not the emotions, the facts. He listened, nodded, and explained my options carefully. I could update my will. I could establish a trust with specific conditions. I could appoint an independent executor. I could ensure that no decisions about my home or finances could be made without my explicit consent. What do you want most? He asked. I didn't hesitate. Control, I said, and clarity. We worked through the details. I asked questions. I took notes. I didn't agree to anything I didn't fully understand. By the time I left, my hands were steady, my path clear. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, respected. Back home, I continued as before. I cooked. I cleaned. I attended church. I smiled at neighbors. No one suspected anything. That was the power of chosen silence. It didn't announce itself. Mark stopped by one afternoon, unannounced. He sat at the table tapping his fingers, avoiding my eyes. He asked if I'd thought more about long-term plans. I looked at him and said, I have. I didn't elaborate. He shifted in his seat, nodded and left shortly after. Linda sent a long message about options she'd researched, assisted living brochures, budget estimates. I thanked her and said I was reviewing things with my attorney. There was a long pause before her reply. Then, a single sentence. Oh, okay. The silence after that was louder than anything I'd heard since the surgery. I finalized the changes the following week. Updated documents, clear instructions, protections in place. Nothing cruel, nothing secret, just firm. When I signed my name, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not triumph, but alignment. My actions finally matched my understanding. I didn't reveal my hearing yet. That would come later when it mattered most. For now, silence still served a purpose. It let me observe how people behave when they think nothing has changed. What I noticed was telling. Conversations became more careful. Suggestions softened. The assumption of control wavered, even without knowing why they felt the shift. One evening, alone in the living room, I turned off the lights and listened to the house settle. I thought about the years I'd spent trying not to be a burden. about how easily that fear can be used against you, and I promised myself something simple: I would never confuse peace with erasure again. Silence had taught me patience. Hearing had given me information. Together they gave me power, not over others, but over my own life. And for the first time, I was ready to use it. Christmas morning arrived quietly, as if the house itself knew something was different. The sky was pale, the neighborhood still, and for once, I didn't feel the usual ache of anticipation mixed with disappointment. I felt steady. Linda and Mark arrived just after 9. I heard the car doors close, the crunch of tires on the driveway, the familiar rhythm of their footsteps on the porch. I didn't rush to greet them. I finished my coffee, set the mug in the sink, and then walked into the living room as they were settling in. They smiled when they saw me, wide, careful smiles, the kind people use when they think they're doing the right thing. We exchanged hugs. I felt Linda's arms stiffen when I held her a moment longer than usual. Mark avoided my eyes. The tree lights blinked softly, and the room filled with the sound of wrapping paper chairs, scraping the floor. Small talk meant to keep everything smooth. For a while, I let it stay that way. Then Mark said something he didn't mean to test. He spoke to his wife across the room, not facing me, his voice casual. "Did you grab the extra batteries?" I looked straight at him and answered, clearly and evenly. "They're in the drawer by the stove." The room froze. Not dramatically. No gasps. Just a sudden, complete stillness, like someone had pressed pause on a familiar scene. Linda's head snapped toward me. Mark turned slowly, his face draining of color. For a moment, no one spoke. I could hear the faint hum of the heater, the ticking clock on the wall, my own breathing, calm, controlled. "You," Linda started, then stopped. "You heard that?" "Yes," I said. "I heard you." Silence spread through the room, thick and unmistakable. Mark opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Since when?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I simply told the truth. "Since before Christmas." Linda sat down hard on the couch. Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. Mark stared at the floor, shaking his head slowly, as if trying to wake himself from a bad dream. I continued, "Because once you decide to speak, you don't stop halfway." "I heard you on Christmas Eve," I said. "On the stairs, talking about me, about the house, about after." Mark looked up sharply. "Mom, we didn't mean." I held up my hand. He stopped. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here to be honest. I heard what you said, all of it, and I need you to hear me now." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "We thought you couldn't hear," she whispered. "I know," I said. "That's why you said it." No one interrupted me this time. I told them how it felt to stand in my own home and listen to my life discussed as a timeline nearing its end. I told them how silence had slowly turned me into someone they planned around instead of planned with. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I described. "I'm not angry," I said, "but I am clear." I explained that I had updated my documents, that my wishes were now written plainly, that no decisions about my home, my money, or my care would be made without me. I didn't threaten. I informed. Mark's shoulders sagged. Linda covered her face and cried, quietly. The room felt heavy, but not chaotic. This wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. "I should have talked to you," Linda said finally. I thought we were helping." "Helping doesn't happen in secret," I replied. "And care doesn't erase consent." They apologized. Not all at once, not perfectly, but sincerely in their own ways. Mark admitted he'd been thinking about the future as a problem to solve. Linda admitted She'd convinced herself that keeping things simple was kinder than having hard conversations. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let their words land. By the end, we were all exhausted, not from yelling, but from truth. We didn't exchange hugs right away. We sat in the quiet and let it be awkward, because sometimes that's what honesty feels like at first. Later, as they were leaving, Mark turned back to me. "I'm glad you can hear," he said softly. "So am I," answered. And I meant it. When the door closed behind them, I sat alone by the tree and listened to the house again. The same walls, the same floors, but something fundamental had shifted. For years, silence had defined me. That morning, my voice did. The days after Christmas unfolded more quietly than I expected. Not with tension, but with a kind of careful respect that hadn't been there before. Linda called instead of texting. Mark asked questions instead of making suggestions. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, but something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer being managed. I was being included. I took time to decide what I wanted next. Not what would make things easiest for everyone else, but what would allow me to live the rest of my life with dignity. I didn't rush it. I walked the neighborhood in the mornings, listening to birds I'd forgotten existed. I cooked meals slowly. I reread old letters from Frank, hearing his voice in my head in a way I hadn't in years. We met again a week later, not to argue or rehash, but to set expectations. I told them what I needed: transparency, consent, and respect. I told them I would make my own decisions about my home and my care, and that I welcomed their support when it was offered, not assumed. They agreed, not perfectly, not without discomfort, but honestly. I chose to stay in my house, not out of stubbornness, but because it grounded me. I made a few changes: grab bars in the bathroom, better lighting, a plan for help if I ever needed it. Practical steps, empowering ones. I showed Linda the list and asked for her input. She smiled, relieved to be asked. Mark helped install the lighting. We worked side by side quietly, like we used to. Forgiveness came in pieces. I didn't hand it out all at once. I didn't need to. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a gift you give to make things comfortable. It's a process you walk through to make things true. I forgave them for speaking carelessly. I didn't excuse the choices that followed. We learned to live with both facts at the same time. The biggest change was internal. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped confusing calm with compliance. I stopped thinking that being agreeable was the same as being loved. Love, I realized, is attentive. It listens even when it's inconvenient. Hearing changed my life, but not in the way I expected. The miracle wasn't sound. It was clarity. Sound gave me information, yes, but silence, chosen and deliberate, gave me strength. I learned when to listen and when to speak. I learned that silence can be wisdom, but only when it's not forced on you. I also learned something about aging in this country. Too many of us are taught to shrink quietly, to be grateful for any attention, to accept decisions made for our own good. We're praised for being easy, for not making waves, but ease can become erasure if we're not careful. Knowledge of our rights, our options, our voices is not defiance. It's dignity. If you're listening to this, and you've ever felt spoken around instead of spoken to, know, this silence does not mean consent, and patience does not mean permission. Ask questions, read the papers, choose someone you trust, and make your wishes clear on your terms. And if you're someone caring for an aging parent, remember, this help works best when it's offered openly, not planned in secret. Love doesn't need to whisper behind closed doors. As for me, I'm still learning the world of sound. I still flinch at sudden noises. I still pause before I speak. But now, when I choose silence, it's because I want to listen, not because I've been dismissed. That night on the stairs taught me something painful. Christmas morning taught me something powerful. And the days that followed taught me something lasting. Hearing the truth can hurt, but it can also save you. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or of a moment when you wished you'd spoken sooner, I invite you to reflect on it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories that honor dignity, choice, and the quiet strength that comes with age, consider subscribing. Your voice matters, even when it's quiet.